This is the first day of Black History Month, 2020, February 1st, 2020. And it comes at a moment when white supremacy seems to be strengthening its hold on our federal government. And it's not just there. On Martin Luther King Day, 2 Mondays ago, we had an amazing image of heavily armed, predominantly white men gathered in front of the Virginia State House to protest some new gun laws that they were considering implementing, and carrying signs asking for a redo of the Civil War. So we have a moment here. Racism is always present in America. It waxes and wanes. It's waxing now. And it's in that vein that I'm especially honored to be up here with my old friend, Kofi Appenteng, whose life is a kind of a monument to fighting for human rights. I'm going to start by asking Kofi if he wouldn't mind telling us a little about himself, and particularly your earliest days, Kofi. You were born in Africa, in Ghana, maybe Accra, I'm not sure. But you,
it was Accra, that's right.
And you left at a amazingly early age. Could you tell us about those early days? And then we'll move on to, we'll slowly work our way up to the present, but this is a good place to start, I think.
Okay, well, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Ken. Is the mic working and for those in the back? I think before I started the boring subject of my life, I just wanted to say that it's a real privilege to be invited to a community center that is a real manifestation of the quality of a community. I was reading about how a real tragedy spurred the founding of this center. It's also a little intimidating to follow people like Khalil and Sherilyn, and I promise you I don't know half as much as either of them on any subject. So as Ken was saying, I was born in Accra, Ghana, which used to be an English colony. And in the year of my birth, about 3 months before I was born, Ghana became an independent country. And the timing of my birth was fortuitous in that it opened up kind of all kinds of possibilities for my family that would not have otherwise been available in a British colony. So I ended up at the age of 5 for a whole bunch of reasons, which are probably, I don't want to wear you out with all those details. For a bunch of reasons, my parents felt it was urgent that I go to school abroad. And they thought the best schools for me were in Great Britain. So I started boarding school when I was 5, and every time my wife gets mad at me, she says it's because of that. So, yeah.
That's it? Well, so let me take you.
Yeah.
Well, so you left the continent when you were 5. Where did you go? And what was it like to be an African at 5 years old going to boarding school in Great Britain?
I mean, the first couple of days I remember quite vividly. I remember hanging onto my mother's skirts, just, wearing out my lungs when she dropped me off. And then after a couple of days, I realized that that wasn't going to actually change anything. And I was the only kind of Afro-descendant in the school. It's a small school. I think there were about 30 little kids there. And they really weren't quite sure how to calm me down. The first thing that they offered me was a banana, because they figured this is what I ate. I had no idea. I think if they'd offered me anything, I would have thrown it at them, but I threw the banana, I remember, back. But a couple of days later, I actually found out that bananas actually taste pretty good. I was there for about a year, and after that it was called the Gateway School. And it was in a place called Great Missenden, which is in Buckinghamshire, just outside of London. And there was a school nearby where an older brother of mine, who had come on the same flight as me, this was in 1962 when I first went, I joined what the English called a prep school called Little Hamden Manor. And that was a converted old Norman manor that had mostly boarding kids, but a few kind of kids from the local community also. That's where I kind of began my kind of formal English education.
Now, Kofi, on the issue of race, were there a lot of other black people in these boarding schools at that time?
So there were three of us. There were about 120 kids. There were three of us. One was a brother who was 3 years older than me, and the other was a old family friend of my father, his son, and we had all been sent to the same school. So that was it.
Oh, we can get back to that. I wanted to ask you, though, I want to fast forward a little bit, not all the way to your chairmanship of the Ford Foundation when you were helping to give away hundreds of millions of dollars, but back to, or forward, depending on when you start counting. You were about 18 years old, and you were planning your future, and somehow you decided to come to the United States of America. Is there something behind that decision that might be interesting to our audience on this day?
Yes, so I think when I was going through what the English now call public school, so it's like the equivalent of high school, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I finished high school. And I really was struggling to kind of understand where I fit in. So I had an older brother who was in the same school and who started buying books, like the autobiography of Malcolm X, like Soul on Ice, like Seize the Time with Bobby Seale. And he would get these books and leave them around, and I would pick them up and start to read them. And then I had an older sister who had a boyfriend who was African American, and so he used to regale me with stories of what was happening in the United States in the 1960s. And he was, I think, a Marine who'd been stationed in the UK. And I started to understand the struggles that Afro-descendants had gone through in the United States. I started to learn that there were people who really were deep thinkers and were pointing out some things that just had never been even part of the discourse during my education. So I had this image that there were Afro-descendants in the US who were really kind of lighting up the world. Right? They were talking about things, about injustice, and about how to deal with that. And that was something that I was never getting in school. One day, I graduated from high school and had been tracked in the sciences, and most African children are told by their parents that they should either be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. And so my mother wanted me to go to medical school. And so I had studied physics, chemistry, and biology for my last 2 years of high school. Was facing the prospect of studying more science in university, which was not that exciting to me. And then one day I used to spend my summer vacations after I was about 12 in Ghana. And I ran into an African-American woman who, she had kind of Angela Davis afro, and she was a recruiter from Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. And I just was one lazy Saturday afternoon, everybody in my house, that was kind of a traditional family lunch we had. And afterwards, a lot of people take a nap. That wasn't really what I used to do. I was really bored, and I figured there was a kid across the street who might want to play table tennis with me, but he was taking a nap. And Lauren Joyson is her name, was there, and basically started to interview me. And I told her that I was going to be studying biochemistry and physiology at University of London, and the way in which I said that, she could tell I wasn't looking forward to it. And she said, you should come to America and go to Wesleyan. At Wesleyan, you won't be the only one. About 10% of our class is African American, and you have a couple of years to figure out what to do. And so she kind of told me all about liberal arts education. And I then didn't see her again for a couple of weeks. And the very day she was leaving town to go back to the US, I happened to bump into her. And she jumped out of the car, ran over, gave me her phone number, address for Wesleyan, and said, I guarantee you'll get into this school. Kind of, I've looked at your record and everything, but you're going to have to wait a year. And because it was, the summer. So I went to see my parents, and my parents were Methodists. And I told them these stories about John Wesley and Wesleyan, and how it would be great if I could go to this school. My father knew an American that he'd done some business with, and called him up and said, will they make him work hard? And he said, oh yeah, they'll make him work really hard. And he said, okay, you can go. That's how I ended up coming to the US.
Okay, so I want to talk about you in Africa. You grew up in a predominantly white world as far as your education was concerned, but you kept going back to Africa. It must feel very different to be in Africa than it does to be in England or America. So I imagine Africa has a special place in your mind, and after being chairman of Ford, you could have run any number of not-for-profits. You chose the Africa America Institute. But let's talk about Africa. You saw the film Black Panther, I should imagine.
Many times.
And it refers...
Because of my daughter.
Who is here this evening, Felicia, and Stephanie, Kofi's wife, his daughter and wife are here. How do you feel about that film, and what did it mean to you, and what do you think it meant to the Americans who saw it?
I think it was kind of fun, right, to see a world in which Afro-descendants had their own stories about how they belonged in the world, and had advanced technology and advanced ideas, so it was a fun experience. It was and also, to me, it was kind of a broader indication that there is interest among many people about Africa and about Afro-descendants. I mean, the appeal of the movie was much broader than just kind of Afro-descendant community.
And it's based on historical fact, isn't it? I mean, not some of the technology stuff, but there was a tribe of Amazons that you mentioned in a talk I read. Could you say something about that?
Yes, so there were very fierce warriors from Dahomey that were women that everybody was terrified of. And I think that was the inspiration for the women warriors in that movie. So I think it was inspired by that.
You know, speaking of Africa and its history, I remember running into a young woman at the Harvard Vision and Justice convening who told a story about being at the British Museum and having a guide explain the dioramas to her, and said, now that one over there, that's a picture of an Egyptian giving an object to an African.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Yeah, so, yeah, no, it's really interesting how the stories we grow up with, which really help kind of give us a sense of the world around us and how we fit in, really affect us in really interesting ways. So this idea that Egypt was not Africa is something that is just one of those kind of ridiculous examples of how these narratives really distort the way we see the world. There are people who have been researching, hieroglyphs from 4,000 years ago, kind of before Christ, right, way before Islam, that really talk about the kind of the intellectual history of those times, and it's really remarkable, some of the ideas and how they come back in history in different ways. But I think it's really, we all make ignorant statements at different times about different things. Everybody's got their blind spots, and Africa is a big one.
Well, you said that a person can be a well-educated person and considered so and know nothing about Africa. The plan this evening is for Kofi and me to talk a bit between ourselves and then open it up to questions. And I hope you'll have some questions about what you know about Africa and maybe ask Kofi to shed some light on that. But is there anything in particular you'd like to emphasize that Americans should know about Africa and its history? It's a huge continent. I don't think people know how big it is, how many people are there, how different the governments are, some of the great statesmen of Africa. Maybe you could just say a few, give us a tour d'horizon of that situation.
Yes, so I'm from, a part of West Africa that has a lot of rich traditions, which we don't learn about in history. But I think the first thing to realize is when you really step back and look at human history, this that there's something that's Africa is a really strange thing, right? So the human race it's in Africa, and many of the great ideas and great innovations, and many of the great people who really made contributions were either African or kind of more broadly Afro-descendant. And I think the reason that people think Africa is, one of the reasons that it's, you know, kind of on the fringes is because stories about Africa, its role in the world, and about the achievements of Afro-descendants really don't belong in the dominant narratives that form kind of our sense of what the world is today. They're just not part of those, and so it's kind of insidious because it affects Afro-descendants as much and in some different ways as it does others. I mean, if you grow up as I did, where all the brilliant ideas, all the great inventions, all the creativity, you know, all the conquests and empires and all the things that kind of young people gravitate towards, right? When none of those have anything to do with Africa or Afro-descendants, it gets in your head, and you don't feel that you're part of this world. You feel like you are on the fringes.
Well, and differently put, it's an important part of the racist narrative that Africans are inferior.
I think it goes a little deeper than that. So, for example, in the work I'm doing at the Africa American, we work with schools, mostly higher education institutions, all over the continent. And if you go to a Mozambique school, and you know, Mozambique is now an independent country run by Africans. When you go at curriculum, you can learn a little bit about some of the kind of traditional ways of living that were there a few hundred years ago. Then you hear about the Portuguese and about their empire and their influence in the world. You then hear about a few, mostly men, who kind of led a liberation struggle, and then you hear you're like 120th on the Human Misery Index. That's kind of what, you know, I'm obviously, you know, just summarizing, but that is essentially what their education looks like today, even though they're free to change it, right? And so if you can imagine you're a young, you know, a young girl in school, you don't see yourself in the history at all, right? You don't really see yourself as part of the world. And I think a huge problem. And so if African institutions aren't even teaching Africans about Africa and its role in the world, it's no wonder that when you go to other places, there is not an appreciation for how we're all connected.
Okay, so I want to talk to you about the place where Africa and America history most dramatically touch each other, and that's slavery. Mm-hmm. It's Article 4, Section 2 of the 1789 Constitution, subsequently superseded by the 13th Amendment, says, quote, "No person held to service of labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So it was that, call it compromise, that is embedded in the Constitution that made it possible for us to have a United States of America. And you see it in the writings of Madison and the other founders, the torturous path they followed to create a government that they wanted to believe was dedicated to the dignity of man. But the slavery trade involved Africans, African traders. Anyway, could you give us your perspective on the slavery? I know it's a huge question, but could you get us started on this topic by saying a few words about the slave trade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's yep. Is this a little better? They're both, yeah, I think they're both, okay. I'll just get the angle right. Yeah, so, yeah, it's, when you look back on these things today, it's just so apparent, right, that it was all built on falsehoods, right? And one wonders kind of how people are able to carry off those kinds of things. But I think that slavery is something that we can only happens when you can kind of, create narratives that dehumanize, right? Because if someone is a human being just like you, it's really, really hard to have the institution exist. But if you can convince people that there's a real big difference, right? Then people really behave in ways that they wouldn't if they really truly embraced kind of humanity.
Well, I'm not a historian, but it's been my observation that culture and history follow technology and military might. So the same thing happened to Africa as happened to China, and around the same time. The Western powers came in with superior technology that they had at that moment in history, and they exploited the situation that they found. It's taken China all this time. The treaty ports started around the time of our Civil War, and now China's on the rise. And it gives me hope that America will someday come to grips with its history and do something by way of righting the situation. But back to the trade itself, there was a lot of money involved. I think in Khalil's talk, he pointed out that the value of the 4 million folks who were enslaved at the time of the Civil War was equal to the entire GDP of America at the time. Yeah. But black entrepreneurs made money on the slave trade.
It's very true. And there's tremendous denial in African countries that were very active. So in my home country of Ghana, I've had friends who are African Americans come to Ghana and see the old slave forts and really get to kind of feel it firsthand, what it was like to be shackled and taken on these vessels. There's some very strange conversations that often occur when you're talking with other Ghanaians who kind of really want to minimize that part of the story. Another part of the story that gets minimized is really the trauma to the communities that were left behind, right? So this is something that academics are now really starting to write much more about and discover much more about. But in order for this thing to work, there had to be a lot of work done to really allow this kind of blatant denial to occur. So I've always wondered kind of what happened to whatever the wealth was that was created in some of these African communities through the slave trade. But as I've come to kind of see how the economics work today, it's pretty clear that the big money was really made here, right? Just like, the mineral wealth of many African countries results in very little wealth creation in those countries, but huge wealth creation in other parts of the world. So it's kind of the way capital works. It was very, I think, transitory, in terms of the economics, but there's it's really important that people, own up to the truth. I know the British, for example, could not really have operated in Ghana without Ghanaian help, right? Just a little mosquito was enough to kill most Brits, right? They would just, it wasn't like when they went to Kenya and they didn't want to leave, or in South Africa where they didn't want to leave. This was where they came by themselves without their families and try to survive a few years. And that was going to be enough to kind of make their fortune. So that there has been real complicity, and I think that's been demonstrated very, very, very clearly, which tells you that there's something kind of bigger to the story. It doesn't end there with the complicity. It's caused me to try to think about kind of how does this kind of thing happen, and people, don't want to really face up to the reality.
So they don't, and in the North, a number of us white people, so-called white people, have we embrace the idea that the slavery was a Southern problem. It was confined to the South. They needed black labor to pick the cotton, and that wasn't our problem. But there was a recent article in the New York Review of Books about fugitive slaves and the compromise that the North and the South tried to achieve as things heated up. The Northern conscience against the Southern commitment to slavery. And there was a famous compromise of 1850 in which the North basically agreed to a fugitive slave law. I think the basic deal was you can either have slaves or not, but if our slaves come north and you see them, you got to send them back to us. And the North could pretend that slavery had nothing to do with them, but maybe you would like to say a word about the truth of that feeling on the North's part.
This could not have worked without the North, right? We know that as a fact, right? Just as you could never have gotten that many Africans on ships over to America. You could not have, the way the system worked was the financing came from places like New York. The Fugitive Slave Act that you're talking about was really, what came through to me about it was the central role that enslaved people played in ending that, right? That it wasn't something that came through enlightenment. You really see how, despite everything, people struggled and fought and insisted on their liberty. And it was really that which kind of helped the U.S. Improve as a country.
Right, and the cotton was turned into clothing by the northern mills.
Yeah.
Machines were made up here.
Yeah. So, I think that one of the really remarkable things for me that brought me to want to come to school here as opposed to in the UK was just how incredible it was that you had African Americans, despite everything, basically, changing this country and changing the world. Like the stories that we were learning in other parts of the world that were about, the work of African Americans in the U.S., really speaking truth to power, were inspiring to people all over the world. It was not a hard decision for me when I had an opportunity to come here because it wasn't happening anywhere else that I knew of.
Your friend Bryan Stevenson, who the film Just Mercy is about, has said, we won the Civil War, but we lost the language war. Yeah. And I think he means things like the South saying, well, the war was really not about race, it was about states' rights. Mm-hmm. You have a comment on that?
Yeah, Bryan is unquestionably, in my view, correct, right? So, and I think it's more than just language, it's actually narrative, right? It's kind of slogans, can be, words can form slogans, but if you really start to believe real, powerful narratives, and you take them as true, then I think you lose the ability to really change things because people assume those narratives are really true. I remember watching Westerns as a young kid, all the cowboys were white, right? We now know that they weren't, right? Between 20 and 25% were actually African Americans. But you could not persuade many people that was true because that's just not how they saw the way the country became, so wealthy. It was because of intrepid explorers and brilliant inventions and courage and all these things. But in reality, you can see how much the wealth that first made the U.S. Prosperous could not have been built without African Americans.
So I'm going to just ask you one or two more questions and then open it up to the audience. And I'm told that the way I have to do this is you ask your question, and then this is being filmed for by the local public television station, and so I have to repeat your question, and then hopefully you'll be able to answer it, or address it anyway. But let me ask you, you gave away, Ford gave away lots of money when you were chairman, and now Darren Walker is in there. I think you were part of the committee that selected him. What, is there any relevance to what Ford is doing to what we've been talking about?
Yes, so, Darren Walker is, a really special human being. Many of you may know his personal story of how he, he grew up, in a poor household, single mother, in a shotgun shack in rural Texas, and ended up becoming a successful kind of lawyer and banker, and then decided he needed to do more with his life, and now is leading a philanthropy. And what he brings to it is a real understanding that they really need to work to support kind of system change, so that it's not, if things still work the same way, you can expect similar results. So they're really trying to support work that is looking to make systemic change.
Like what? Like what?
So things, one good example would be that the way the economic system works is that without government policy that gives workers' rights and allows citizens to participate, you're never going to change anything. So a lot of the organizations they support are working to kind of change the rules of the game. So that's why Cheryl and Eiffel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund now has the kind of support that she never had before Darren, because he understands that if they are not successful in changing the rules of the game, then the results will remain the same. Same thing with Bryan Stevenson.
Okay, I think we're ready to open up the floor to questions. So please, if you have a question, I'll be able to hear it. Just raise your hand, state your name, and I'll do my best to convey the question. Must be something we're doing to these microphones, that's all.
I'm sure somebody has a question.
Do you miss practicing law?
The question is, do you miss practicing law in a law firm? We skipped the part where you went and got a legal education, became a lawyer. I met Kofi when he was chairman of the board of an outfit called the International Center for Transitional Justice, which basically used Desmond Tutu and Mandela's techniques to find a way to deal with the oppressor once peace breaks out. And so, Kofi, I think you would probably agree that black rights are human rights. But you were making money for some years. Were you always involved in taking the nice question you were just asked? How did you feel about being a lawyer in that context?
Yeah, so I don't miss it today. For about 20 years, I enjoyed it. I was advised when I was in law school to do civil rights work. And then I interned at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and realized that the talent there far exceeded mine. Like, there was no way I was ever going to get a job at a place that would employ Cheryl and Eiffel, right? What they all actually wanted was they wanted people who were in business, who were in philanthropy, that they could look to support and argue for them. So if you look at who they try to attract on their boards, it tends to be folks who have reach in other parts, and I just didn't think I had the talent. I also realized that there weren't lawyers who were at law firms that would take on kind of Afro-descendant clients that were maybe entrepreneurs. So what I did was I first showed that I could kind of do the work, and then found a balance between the more Wall Street type clients who pay a lot of money, and then others who, if you were making money for the firm, they would let you represent. And then I decided that the best way for me to use my pro bono time wasn't on individual cases, but was on board service, where institutions were kind of desperate for people with a legal background who cared about their issues to be on their boards. And I found that much more rewarding than working on individual cases.
We have a question?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hare is asking you to identify a country or two that is most promising economically and exemplary in the human rights area.
Mm-hmm. So there's 54 countries, and I probably know about 20 fairly well that I've been to many times and have kind of understood how they work. And the rest, I've touched them, but I haven't really studied them. So I don't find the country analysis to be very helpful when you're looking at economic activity and economic opportunities for investment. It's really about finding places where you can have partnership with people who know and understand the environments and who you can trust, right? And they can be, some of them can be operating in countries that the macroeconomic analysis tells you they're challenging, but they might actually be able to navigate that very, very well. I don't find the macro analysis very helpful. So like like my home country of Ghana, most times if you look, people will tell you it's one of the better places for business. It really just depends on who your partners are there, right? It can be terrible. You might have a really good, very savvy, very trustworthy partner. Maybe she's in the DRC, and she's the one, Democratic Republic of Congo. She might be the one that you can actually work with. The other thing I'd say is that the ones that play the best in terms of their kind of stories, in terms of they seem the most stable, often aren't, right? So there are some countries where you hear about lots of political turmoil. Many of those places are actually pretty interesting places and pretty safe places to visit. Why? Because people can speak out and they can have different points of view without it meaning they get locked up, right? So you go to a place like Kenya, and it's really, right now, everybody's trying to figure out what's going to happen next. But you can see on the surface all the problems, right? You can go to another place
Happen next as to what?
What's that? Happen next in terms of who's going to be the president of the country. What's going to happen in terms of their border with Somalia, right? They've had issues with terrorist attacks, etc. But there are other places where things seem quiet, but if you actually talk to people there, that's just because they don't feel free to express themselves. And so some of those places, I think, are places you have to really avoid.
I've got some questions here that are anonymous. Here's a good one. This just in, as they say. When the president referred to many African nations as shithole nations, what was the response or reaction of the African American Institute, the African American Institute?
Okay. So we were not surprised by it. I mean, it wasn't in a press release, right? It was one of those things that was one of the many conversations that people have that they think won't get out, and when they get out, right? So there was mostly negative reaction in African countries. Like if you talk to the ambassadorial corps, they were deeply offended, right? Most people you met really just thought it was a sign that there really wasn't much understanding about Africa in political circles in the U.S. There were some young activists who kind of turned it around and said, well, there is a lot more we need to do to get better, and kind of used it more as a kind of as a rallying cry. But it did not build the ties between the U.S. and African countries.
I assume by your answer that the Institute didn't do anything official by way of response to this leak.
No, what we really started doing was we have alumni who are the kind of the people who have come through our programs, who are all over the continent. And what we did was feature some quotes they made. We try not to kind of be the voice, right? We try to be the platform where the voices feel comfortable coming. So we did a series of those kinds of announcements where we got quotes from people who were clearly addressing it. But quite often in a lot of African cultures, you don't dignify it with a direct response. You say something that's kind of above the fray. And so we had a number of things like that we put out there.
I have a question in the back.
Yes, the 13 travel ban countries are on the continent of Africa. Chad was and then was taken off. How is that impacting the Institute's work? Is it a hindrance? Do you have any thoughts about why or making the change and getting that ban?
So Lisa's asking you about the travel ban, the fact that 6 of the 13 countries that are on it are on the African continent. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's so there are basically 2 types of people who come to the U.S., right? Some choose to come. They have a lot of places they can go, and they come here. Others, this is the place that they feel like they have to go. Like they don't have a lot of choice necessarily, and a lot of them have to live in the shadows, right? I think among the elites, people who have options, I mean, they're all, rather than do, a lot, there are a lot of families that do big weddings abroad, who are, elite educated families, and they do it because their family is all over the world, right? So lots of Nigerians are here in the UK, in Canada, in other parts of Europe, et cetera, and they have these big family gatherings. So, I mean, they're all just saying, well, we won't do them here, right? And so I don't think it's something that people are, like, if you don't want to see it, then we'll spend our money. And then others who are stuck here, they have to retreat more into the shadows, right? And there's going to be, I think, it's going to be much, much tougher for a lot of kind of working people who don't have a lot of choice, who have a one job where they're able to send money home, and now they're worried that if they leave, they won't ever be able to get back in.
Back there?
My name is Jeff. There are 2 organizations on the continent that I have in mind, the ANC and the OAU. Does your institute work with either one of those organizations?
Do you work with the ANC or the OAU? Does the Africa American Institute work with them?
Okay, so the African National Congress is the party of Nelson Mandela. It's the one that kind of was at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle. And AI has a lot of ties with them because when Mandela was branded a terrorist, and it was illegal for them to go to school, the African American Institute actually ran schools in what are called the frontline states, which were the ones that bordered South Africa. And that's where many of the leadership got some education. We gave a Lifetime Achievement Award, I think, to Nelson Mandela at one of the events we did. We have a lot of South Africans and Southern Africans who are among those alumni. So the OAU is now called the AU, the African Union. We work with them in that we coordinate often with them. They participate in conferences that we have, and we consult with them on different things. Sometimes they think we can be useful to them. So when there's a new ambassador for the African Union in New York, they come and see us, and we go and see them, and we try to collaborate on different projects.
We have a question in the front here. I'll be to you in just a minute, but we have an actual Appenteng here. Kofi's daughter wants to ask him a question that she couldn't have asked over the dinner table.
Question and a half. Kind of first one being, when you had your sort of awakening politically inspired by African Americans when you were in the UK, what were a couple of the most interesting African historical figures that really inspired you, that you think are stories that are worth knowing? And then a second kind of question, I guess it was two questions, about the African American Institute. I'm curious to kind of to know through your scholarship program if you've had any kind of big results from that.
So first question is, who inspired you? You mentioned American civil rights leaders actually pulling you to the United States. Who were they? And as to the Africa America Institute, do you have any alumni from your scholarship programs that you think are exemplary?
Thank you, Felicia. Some of the people who were most influential in kind of my teenage years were people like Angela Davis, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, kind of all the ones that have really had a huge impact on the world, not just in the United States. There are several of our alumni that that actually dozens of them have had big historical impact. Maybe the one that would be most interesting to this audience is that we provided assistance to Barack Obama Sr. And I think it was 1959 when he was at the University of Hawaii, and he wrote a letter saying that he needed help. And then the next thing I saw in our files was his thank you letter about how without that assistance, he doesn't know how he would have made it. And, his life had a lot of challenges, as many of you may know, but being able to stay here, creating the first African president, right? So there's like that. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was the first president of Nigeria, was a student of one of our founders of the African American Institute. There were two African Americans who founded the African American Institute. Horace Mann Bond, who was the first Afro-descendant president of Lincoln University, and William Leo Hansberry, who is credited with starting the first area studies program, an African studies program, that really is all the rage these days because everybody's interdisciplinary. He was the first one to really put that together at Howard University. And Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, was one of his students. They really, they founded the Institute because they thought that there was much that could be learned from their experience in the U.S. To help these newly independent emerging African countries forge their own future. And that was kind of the inspiration for the founding of AAI.
Was Kwame Nkrumah like the George Washington of Ghana? Or was he a famous, successful statesman?
So he was the most popular of the men who kind of led our struggle for independence from colonialism. So he was a wildly popular figure in Ghana as our first president, and went on to have kind of a mixed legacy because he ended up getting deposed in a coup, and so many Ghanaians feel like if he had been able to stay, things would have been much better. Others aren't so sure. So, but he was a very gifted leader.
Okay, we have a question from over here.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about last year being a year of return to Ghana, and the fact that many African Americans are getting dual citizenship right away. Ghana is offering dual citizenship to African Americans immediately, and some of the opportunities that are available in Ghana. And the second question is about the beaches in Accra. I hear they rival any beach anywhere.
So you're being asked about Ghana's year of return last year and the dual citizenship that is being offered to Americans, and also about the beaches in Accra.
Okay. So, so the year of return is something that was started by the Ghanaian government to mark the 400th anniversary of slavery, which is kind of commonly thought to have been 1619. The idea was to encourage Afro-descendants anywhere in the world to come and experience Ghana. Most Afro-descendants have never been to an African country. Ghana really focused on kind of the English-speaking world because we're an Anglophone country, and it was a really successful effort. Thousands of people came and experienced Ghana for the first time, and I think what they do as a follow-up, I know there are plans to kind of build deeper relationships, will, I think, determine whether it's going to have a lasting impact. But they were very happy in Ghana with the number of people who came, and they're trying to encourage deeper ties.
What about those beaches?
So, yeah. So I think there are some great beaches. My favorite beaches in Ghana are kind of in the western region of the country, and they are beautiful, but they're not Caribbean. Like you need to stay close to shore. Our seas are they're very strong currents, and so whilst it's not like going to the Caribbean where there's a coral reef that kind of protects you from the elements. They are they're rough seas around Ghana, but there are some great places to go along the coastline.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, maybe several, but while we're on this subject, Kofi, African-American friends of mine have told me it's quite different to be on the streets of America, whether you're in the black community or the white community. What's it like to be in a country where black people are in the majority? How do you feel different when you're there?
Yeah, so the first time, as I said, I left home when I was 5, and don't have a lot of sense of what it was like then. When I went back in my teens, I didn't actually realize that I had been feeling tense until I had been home for a couple of days, and just being able to blend is very relaxing, right? I was always just very conscious that, if I entered a room, it seemed like, eyes were on you. So it's I think something everybody needs to experience is to be, part of the majority sometimes. And it took a long time for it to happen to me. But as I said, when I was coming to Wesleyan, one of the biggest draw for me was of 10% of the student body was Afro-descendant, which I'd never seen. So it just felt much more comfortable when you could see other people like you. So I highly recommend it.
I have a question here from someone in the room who says, who are some of the Caucasian leaders who are doing good things for racial justice? And what are they doing? How can we emulate them?
I think that all successful movements are diverse, right? So just as I was what Afro-descendant leaders. They yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So this is fun. So I think that the best thing I think one can do is aspiring to be leaders. Groups pick their leaders, right? And the best leaders don't vie. They because of the play, and there are lots not to be the organizations they are today without strong support, ideas.
Okay, so I'm going to take the last question. And first of all, I want to thank you for coming. It's been very enriching, very informative. And for those that did not have a chance to have your question, I'm sure that you can speak with Mr. Appenteng afterwards. I always ask this question of all of our guests because of the fact that we are doing the work to help our Black and our brown children. What advice or what, if you had to give them a word, as far as a word to them in this day and time, as to the things that they should be aware of or something that you want to encourage them to do, what would you say to the Black and brown children of today that would help them?
So I really think that this question of narratives that we grow up with, I really do think that it's really important to integrate diverse narratives into the stories that we tell about our communities, our countries, our world. And I think that if children get those at an early age, I think it fortifies them to really find their place in the world. It's really important, right, to have food and shelter and be safe. But once you have those, I don't think you find your full potential unless you see yourself as part of the world and see the common links you have with others. So to me, the whole point of integrating these narratives into the core of what we learn in our education is it shows how we connect. We're all connected. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, we're going to end this at 7, but Bonnie has permitted another question or two. I'm giving Kofi a sneak peek at the next penultimate question. Sir. Question is, what strategies can we employ to increase minority participation in local government and state?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that or pretty much anything, yeah. So it seems to me that if you can create opportunities for people to get together, right, in a warm kind of environment, much like this one, only good things happen, right? When people see this is the manifestation of a caring community, right? Had a tragedy, responded. This is still here. Decades later, helping the community. So to me, I don't think one can be very directive about this. I think one just has to create an environment that is welcoming and people will become engaged.
I think you're holding a question that asks you what your favorite African-American authors are, but you might want to add why they're your favorite if you care to mention a name or two.
Well, it actually says African authors.
Oh, African. Okay.
Yeah. So there's someone called Aikwe Ama, who was born in Ghana. He's now 80 years old, and who writes prose. Just such a gifted writer. I think Chimamanda Adichie with unusual talent, and Chinua Achebe. I think he was the first African writer I ever read, and just made an indelible impression on me.
Okay, one last question. Well, you already had a question, Jeffrey. I'll come back to you if no one raises their hand. Yes.
Sort of going back to your answer to Bonnie's question, how would you say is the best way to sort of diversify and expand the narrative that people receive about African, like Africa?
So the question is, picking up on Bonnie's, what's the best way for what I guess has to be a counter-narrative in America? What's the way for people to, I'm not sure I'm getting this right, get a diverse narrative and develop a better understanding of the proud history of black people on the continent and the world? Is that?
Yeah, so of material, but it tends to be available if you have a special interest, right? So when you're in university, if you decide you want to study African American studies or women's studies, African studies, Latino studies, it's off on the side as something that you can get into if you want to, right? So I think one has to be very intentional about this, right? There are, in the core curriculum at each level, decisions are being made by school boards in some systems. In Mozambique, we're working with a place called Universidad Pedagógica, which is their kind of teacher training college that creates curriculum. And so we're working with them by helping connect them with people who have already done tremendous amounts of work. And so I think it's, this really comes down to choices that teachers and school systems are going to make because of what they hope to achieve. So most schools, I'd say many schools, say that they're trying to prepare young people for a global world. And, by 2050, about half of the young people on this planet will be Afro-descendant. So if you really want to prepare your child for a global world and they grow up thinking they're well educated and they know nothing about Africa and its role in the world or about the achievements of Afro-descendants, I think you're falling down on the job, right? So it has to be very intentional, and one has to find a way to balance to integrate these narratives into the core.
That's a terrific note to end on. Let's give Kofi Appenteng a special hand.